Hello everyone. Today we're going to go through and show you some useful design tips and techniques and how we can look at creating some attractive publications using desktop publishing programs such as Microsoft Publisher. So what we're going to go through and do is first off just talk about what a desktop publishing program is, and probably the most commonly used one within an industry would be Adobe InDesign. So it's a very high-end powerful program that brings in a lot of the functionality and features from Photoshop. Has some amazing tools and features in here, but it is quite expensive and very powerful. Has quite a steep learning curve for us. So we're going to be looking to use Microsoft Publisher, which we have the option to get a free version of through our school email accounts, and you can actually download Publisher 2016. I'm going to use Publisher 2013 as you can see on my desktop here, and a lot of the tools that we're going to be able to use in this program can be applied to the new versions and also even to InDesign. So the techniques that we're going to try and talk about should be applicable to just about all programs that you're going to be working with. So first off, what is a desktop publishing program? Well, I like to think of it as a program that is used to combine text and graphics in an attractive way. Now often the text is made in like a word processor, and the images are often made in a photo editing program such as Photoshop. And then all we're doing is bringing them together and then tweaking and playing with the design and the layout to make great looking things. So first up, we're going to be trying to design a zombie apocalypse survival guide, and some of the resources that you can see have been provided in this folder here. So we've got a range of different line drawings that have been created, and I've gone off and found a couple of extra images to try and teach you about a few other techniques that you might find helpful. So before you even start looking at designing a booklet, it's important to know how much room you've got and how much text and copy you've been provided with. So I'm going to open up the text, or the copy we sometimes refer it to, in a word processing program to proof and check the text for any errors. And ways that we can try and do that is by pushing F7 on our key in Microsoft Word, or by going to the Review tab, Spelling and Grammar, because a desktop publishing program is not really designed to do the same tool as well as Microsoft Word or other word processors. So there's a few common errors that I've tried to create in here, and we're just going to go through and check to see if we can find out all the errors. And there's a few other ones that I'd like to draw your attention to. At the top here we've got the word prepared that was spelt incorrectly, and it's not being picked up because of the fact that it is actually all in sentence capital letters. So by putting those back to proper lowercase, then you'll actually be picking up the fact that there is an error and it should be spelled differently. To be consistent with all the other words within the sentence here, a lot of those should be probably placed into different cases there. Okay, this is going to be our main title, so we may decide to capitalize the start of each letter, start of each word here, and let's just check if there's anything else through this. Because often the text has been provided to you, it doesn't just give you the right or the ability just to skip over it. It's important that you proofread your work, or proofread the stuff that's been provided, because there could be some errors like we've already found, or down here where there is some bullet points that aren't actually capitalized, whereas all the others are capitalized. So we're after consistency here, and a couple of other things that we might look at is there's some quite large gaps, and one of the items that we're going to start looking at further down the track is removing these gaps, which have been applied through pushing the enter key, which is what the show hide character symbol here will try and indicate. Each of these little backwards P's are showing that the enter key only has been pushed, and we're going to use the correct tool to try and space these out. Each of these items here, which are all by themselves, indicate subheadings, and the text that is following it relate to these headings. So it's important that we try and keep these things together, because if we start moving things around, we will disrupt the sequence of our document, and the flow won't feel the same. So after having a bit of a read of this, I've noticed the fact that this is some kind of introductory text which is described in the booklet. So I may decide to make this be placed on, say, a first page of our little booklet form, and make this stand out in some way. Okay, so now that I'm happy with this particular text, I might decide to copy and paste all of it by pushing Ctrl A to select all, and then Control C to bring it across. So it's now in the memory of the computer, and I'm going to open up Publisher now. When I bring up Publisher, you'll notice that we can use something called the orientation of our page, and we've got A4 portrait or A4 landscape. So depending on the format or the layout of your document, you'd commonly use one of those for like a poster type form. We're going to be making a little booklet in here tonight, so we're going to select more blank page sizes, and then from here, going down to the booklets option, we're going to select an A4 booklet. This option here is also an A4 booklet, but it's more like a drinks list that you'll see at a restaurant, which is tall and thin and narrow. So select the A4 booklet, double click it, and you'll see this little message box that pops up. Because it needs to be a booklet, it needs to automatically insert some pages, so select yes. Now what you'll notice is the fact that we've got 1, 2, 3 and 4 pages for this. So pages 1 and 4 will print on one side of the paper, pages 2 and 3 will print on the other. Pages 2 and 3 indicate the middle of the booklet, so once it is opened up, this is what it will look like. Next thing that I like to do with all my publications is to go into the Page Design tab and to alter something called the margins. The margins are these blue lines that you can see, and what happens is if we don't alter them, we're actually quite far away from the edge of the page, which means if we were to go through and place information and pictures and graphics on our page, there's actually quite a lot that we're not using. So our printers can get pretty close to the edge there, and narrow seems to be the best setting for us. So I can get around about half a centimetre away from the edge of our page. Commercial printers or offset printers can print all the way off the edge of them. However, most of the printers that we've got here at school and also at your home would not be able to do this, but using narrow guides are pretty handy. So now that we've got that, we're able to look at framing up our document. Other things that we sometimes want to do is look at using grids or guides, and this can help achieve balance on our pages. So for instance, doing a 3x3 grid may help us to try and indicate where we want to try and frame things up onto our page. So that could be an option that you might like to look at. Alright, so from this first page, I'd like to make this kind of stand out, and some of the things I'd like to try and do for this is to get a background. So because it is a zombie based theme, I'm looking for blood background, and I've also gone under the search tools the ability to look for reuse with modification. What this is saying is it's basically a copyright free image that I'm able to reuse and to not be in fear of breaching somebody's copyright. So I quite like this one here, which I've selected, and this is the image that I'm going to try and click on view, and by doing that it allows me to download this. Okay, so it's important that when you are finding an image that you click on the view image, because this is often just an indexed image that is still quite small, and we need to make sure that it's of a nice size, because if we're wanting to do any Photoshop work on it, or if we're wanting to use it as a background, anything that is too small is going to be potentially a problem for us. Generally, a lot of these reuse ones have come from a place called Flickr, which is a great photo sharing site, and as a result they're normally of a higher resolution than say some of the ones you can find without using those tools. Other things that you can do is to ensure that you are getting a large picture is to select large under this option here, and again these will be bringing up pictures that we can be assured will be of a good dimension and with a good pixel rate inside. So now that I've got that there, I'm going to look at bringing this information onto our page. The grey that you can see on the edge here is like the desk, with the white being the paper that you can see. So anything I place in the grey area is like on a working place, which can be accessible across all of my middle pages as well. So in order to do this, I can just grab each of my pictures and drag them across onto my page, and this is where using split screen can be quite helpful, so you can do this quite quickly. What I'm going to try and do is select all of my things that I'd like to bring across, including my zombie background, but not the text at this stage. So I'm going to click on that, drag it across, and I'll make a bit of a mess by putting them all on top of each other, which I would then need to spread out. Okay, so here it is. I've now spaced them out, and I can see the types of images that I might like to deal with. Now, as I mentioned, because this is in our working area or scratch area, if I click on pages 2 and 3, you'll see I've still got access to all that information that I placed on the outside of the page. So the next thing I'm going to try and do is to copy all of this information from my word processor and bring it onto my page here by framing up a text box. Big difference between a word processor and a desktop publishing program is that you need to frame up where you'd like the information to go. So in this case I'd like to do some text, so I'm going to draw a text box and simply Control V to paste it into my text box here, and by zooming in by pushing F9 or Control plus the wheel mouse to zoom in and out, you can now see how much text you've got to try and play with to fill up your document. Alright, so going back to page 1. Page 1, I don't want to put too much information on there because I'd like to make it really stand out. So there is an expression sometimes used called sometimes less is more, and that refers to the fact that by often not putting too much information onto a page, we can actually make it really stand out to quite good effect. So what I'd like is I'd like this picture here to be my background. Now there's several ways that I can do that. I could look at simply placing it like so, and then just increasing the size of this particular image and then retweaking things around. Normally we never use these handles to resize images because we can take images out of proportion, which I'll show you later on. However, because this is simply a background, it is able to be restretched and you won't tell the difference because there's nothing which tells you the correct sizing that this should be in. So that would be one technique. Another technique that I'm going to try and show you here today is the fact that by selecting this image and going up to the page design option under this version of Publisher, I can actually apply this image and make it fill the background of this page. By doing that, I can't actually select that image now, so it's kind of locked in there, and it's been applied to the master background of this particular page here, which is quite useful for me to be able to lock that in and to not be able to mess with it further down the track. So I may decide to add that to all of my pages. So we use a concept called repetition, but I'm just going to play it by ear and see what it looks like further down the track. So some other images that I might like to be placing onto this could be this kind of black zombie head, but by placing that on there you may notice that it doesn't really stand out as much now because of the fact that we've got this deep red background and the black's not really standing out. So some techniques to get around that would be to recolor that particular image. By recoloring it, we can actually try and bring that contrast back, and if we don't like any of those particular colors because it doesn't really time with my theme, I could use more variations, go to white. You can see now that that really does stand out. One thing I may decide to do is to actually try and tie this color in rather than being white, is to actually make it similar to this red theme here. By doing that, by going recolor, I could actually come in here and pick out a color that is similar to it, such as this dark red, and then alter that maybe to be a bit lighter. But I'll show you this technique again shortly. The next thing that I'm going to try and introduce is when we're wanting to draw some additional text boxes onto my page. I'm going to put in here zombie survival guide. Now, very difficult to read this text. One, because it has no contrast. It has no contrast because of the black and the fact that it's small writing and it's not standing out. We want this to stand out, so I'm going to highlight this and use some techniques to make things stand out. Some of the techniques that we can use is by increasing the size of the font. Another thing that we can do is we can bold and italicize to make things stand out. I don't like using the underline technique. Okay, so bold and italicizing is probably a really good technique to make things stand out. Even better is to go through and find a font that is not Calibri. Calibri is the default standard font, and it's, you know, everybody kind of sees it and knows it. So why not go through this font list and find out a font that looks really, really cool. So I quite like this Chiller font. I think it kind of looks and feels a bit like the zombie kind of guide feel, genre if you will. And I'm going to apply this black and this bolding and this italicizing. Again, it's still not great in terms of contrast, and that's because of the color choices that we've got. We know that white stands out, so let's try and see whether white is a good option for us. Okay, so that does stand out, and maybe if I was to look at center aligning it, we can look at seeing what this looks like from afar, and it certainly has good contrast now between the background and the foreground. The technique that I just like to show you here is that if we wanted to try and pick out maybe the reds from this background and apply it to our font. One of the techniques that you might like to use is the fact that we can actually pick out a colour using the sampling tool. Using the sample, I'm going to sample the dark red by clicking on the eyedropper tool, and you'll notice now that this red is making the text very difficult to see. By selecting that, however, what I can do is bring out the fact that this is selected, go to more colours, and now it has picked out all of the reds, and I'm going to just lighten the hue of this to go closer to white, but not quite white. That's white all the way at the top. I'm going to go a light version of that red, and as a result now I've actually got a red that kind of is in keeping with the background, but also is still showing good contrast. I'm going to change potentially the recolouring of this, and I might like to look at using that same kind of light red background there. So there's my first page starting to frame up. Next thing I'd like to do is to bring some of this introductory text across. Now, as an editor, you can kind of decide what you'd like to bring in. Sometimes you have to use all of it. In this case, I'm going to use this opening paragraph. I'm going to Control X that to try and cut it, and I'm going to try and bring this in down the bottom here by framing up a new text box. So you'll notice that when I've dragging this text box across, this blue line is showing, and that's to indicate that it's matching up with the edges of this additional text box across the top. So we want to have things nicely aligned because that's the way our Alright, so now that we've got those text boxes nice and aligned, we can look at sticking our text. So Control V to copy it in, and we've got the same problem as we had before in terms of contrast. So I could either go through and change it to the white, or I can use that colour that we picked out before. Another problem that we've got here is because of the fact that it has got this background that is showing through. One of the things you can do as a technique is to try and fill that text box with, say, a colour, and I might like to use that dark red colour. And I can also go through and alter the transparency of that text box to try and have that image in the background kind of bleed through this. So by doing that now, we've got the contrast back, and you'll notice if I bring this onto the grey background, the fact that we've got this colour, it's a little bit see-through or transparent, and it does help for the contrast for this page. So having a bit of a play now with some of those items. Okay, using the align tool, we can align the centers of those items so they get things perfectly aligned. Now obviously for this to work, we need to have them at the same size or width. If I was to use this option under align, we'll end up with quite different results. Okay, so actually it hasn't come out too bad. Alright, so there we are, we've got maybe our first page sorted out, and I may like to tweak some of those items. After selecting some of those tools, I can use the arrow keys to do a nudge, and this is basically allowing me to have nice fine control over the placement of some of those ideas. Okay, so once you're happy with that opening page, I'm then going to look at bringing in the middle text to see how this will fill up my page. Another thing here on this first page that I might like to try and do is alter the font away from the likes of this default font of Calibri. I might try and choose a font that I think looks quite good. Could increase the size of it slightly. There we go. One of the other options or problems that we sometimes have is when we have a text box that's just a little bit too small for all of the text in there, and you may notice that when I've resized this box, I've got these three little dots. That indicates that there is text in overflow, or there is text that is cut off. So obviously if I was to resize these boxes here, you may notice that that becomes more of a problem. Okay, however, what I'm going to go through and do now is to go through and to resize things. Alright, so going into these middle pages now here, I'm going to try and look at framing up where I want all of this information to try and go. So I'll try and bring all the text in to start with. I'm simply going to bring this text box over here and try and shape it onto the page to see how much room I've got. Alright, so because these images are quite well sized, okay, I can actually look at bringing them onto my page and seeing how things might frame up. Okay, we want to try and keep them of a similar kind of level of importance, and one of the ways to do that is by keeping them at the same kind of size. So in terms of keeping things in the correct sequence, we'd need to make sure that the things like the fitness text is actually being associated with this running kind of foot, and the supplies that you can see there is matching up with the correct image. This is a concept called proximity, and we need to make sure that related items are kept close together. You'll notice that when I go and place this text on top of the writing here, on top of the image, that's a little bit hard to read. So I might like to look at doing some of these things like the wrapping choices to try and have this text wrap around it. In order for this to work, I need to 1, change the wrapping, and then 2, bring the picture forward so this wrapping occurs. You'll notice there's a bit of text cut off over here, which is not great, so using the nudge tool I can try and alter that slightly. Once you're happy with some of the positioning of these items here, okay, we may need to look at resizing things even further. So I've got this text box at the moment that I've got it going over kind of more than half the page here, so I could decide to frame this up in a number of ways. I could choose to break this page up into columns, or use singular text boxes to do this. Using that same concept that we had before within word processing, we're going to turn on the hidden characters to kind of see how this document has been formatted. So if I was just to zoom in here a wee bit, all these extra enters that you can see, I'm going to go through and remove those. And what was I just noticed there before is that once I did that, I've actually inserted a little dot, which is the equivalent of the spacebar being pushed. So I need to get rid of that so that the text is nicely aligned. So I'm going to come through here now. These are supposed to be bullet points, or they're nice short sentences, so a good way to make those stand out is by using bullets. Okay, removing some of these extra enters, because what we'd like you to see you do is the fact that we're going to create contrast not by using extra enters but by using other fonts. And because I'd like to try and keep repetition coming through, I'm going to pick out the same font, maybe look at increasing the size of things. Could look at doing the bolding option in order to try and make things stand out from the main text. Okay, so reduce these out. I'm going to leave this one here deliberately like so. Okay, getting rid of all these gaps. Gaps away. Okay, and I'm going to just reduce now the size of this text box, which is very, very large. And I'm going to show you some other concepts which could be quite useful. Some of the things that we want to try and do here is actually try and apply good repetition through my text. So if I'm wanting to try and do that, I've used the similar kind of font. I'm going to use the same kind of color. I'm going to probably look at making it bold and doing some kind of line spacing to make this stand out. Rather than pushing enter to try and make the heading stand out from the text, a technique that you can use is paragraph spacing. By using paragraph spacing after, this means that after I push the enter button, this is the gap that will occur between this paragraph and the next paragraph. I'm going to look at increasing that up slightly so that this main text that you can see here is being bumped down a wee bit from this heading. Because we're after some consistency coming through, what I would like to do is to apply this formatting to all of my other subheadings. One of my favorite tools that you can use within Office products is the Format Painter tool. By double clicking this now, you'll notice that my cursor is changed on my mouse. I'm able to left click and drag over this writing, and it will paste that same formatting onto whatever I select. Now by doing that, we're getting good consistency, some good repetition of all of the fonts. When I'm finished, either go up and click the Format Painter tool again, or push the escape button to go through and turn that off. Alright, so now we're starting to get the structure of our document there, but what I'm wanting to do is either try and look at wrapping this information into columns, or I could look at having additional frames placed onto my page. So here it is, back to a single kind of column, if you will, and I'm going to try and resize some of these items, place them inside of the text to see how things might look at shaping up. Okay, so I've got here, there's my house that relates to this text. I'm going to do the wrapping like we did before, maybe bring it forward, there's the wrapping occurring, coming down the bottom of my page, Okay, and then we're looking at bringing some of these other items across. So the problem that we've got now is similar to what we introduced before, and that is we've got text and overflow. What I'd like to do now is to flow this article onto the second page. So again, by clicking on this icon, you can frame up where you'd like this information to go by either drawing your own text box or just by clicking with the overflow tool into a blank space. It will actually draw and insert a text box for you. Okay, so I'm going to resize that text box, and again there's some more text and overflow, but if I was to resize my text box here, okay, there it is. That's now all of the text onto my pages. So that's all the text that I've been provided for this exercise, so you can kind of get a bit of an idea of now how much room I've got to play with in terms of being able to put images in here. So here's my fitness particular picture, keeping that nice and close to my other stuff. Okay, I'm going to do the square wrapping, bring it forward, there's the wrapping. If I'd like to try and create some of those interesting effects with text wrapping, one of the tools that we've covered in the class is the fact that we can actually edit the wrap points to make the text come much closer. Because this is a transparent GIF that's been inserted, you'll notice that it's already picked out the edges of those lines. If you were to want to do that manually, because we've got another image, we can go through and take these little marker points and alter them. In order for this to actually work, you need to do two things. You need to alter the wrap points and then make sure that they're picking up the edges of the image that you'd like to wrap around, and then what we do is we indicate that we'd like it to be done square. Tight, I should say. By doing that, it will pop up this little dialog box, and you need to read it carefully because it's always a bit confusing to me. If you've manually changed the wrap boundary for this picture and you want to keep that boundary, click No. So we have changed the wrapping boundaries, and we do want to keep that, so click on No, and you'll notice now the text is actually wrapping much closer to this person's foot. It has, however, jumped across on the other side, so I don't want that to occur. So I may look at altering the wrapping on the right hand side of this so that that doesn't actually happen. Okay, so there it is, just tweaking that a little bit and then clicking away, and I can look at resizing that leg down and altering it down as needed. I could do the same thing with some of these other items if I wanted to. Alright, next item that we might want to try and do is potentially going through and altering or finding some other pictures. So these pictures already were transparent to start with, but what if we were to try and find some other pictures? So here's a picture that I've found that I'd like to use. It's a Lego zombie, and it's got white in the background that I'd like to get rid of. So if you don't have the likes of Photoshop, which is a great program for doing photo editing, or maybe your skills in that program are not that great, there's a few ways that you can get around this. One of the easiest ways to do it is to actually use the likes of Publisher to go through and format the picture, and to look at resetting or setting a transparent color. This works really well when there's good contrast between the background and foreground. So at the moment we've got a really good definition between this particular shape here and the background, apart from where the shadow is. If I click on the white, it will make all of the white transparent, and while it's done a pretty good job, you may or may not be able to see this very clearly, but we've got quite a lot of white that's been left behind here. So if I go to reset my picture and put it back to the way it was, this is the original size and shape and form of it. I'm going to go and cut this and go into the likes of PowerPoint, which again you've got the option of downloading and using for free, and there's a couple of great tools in here that aren't available in other programs. So by clicking on the Picture Tools option, I can elect to remove the background. Now by doing this, what it does is it makes anything that's purple, this purple colour will be deleted. So for instance the head would be chopped off in this case. I'm going to click on this mark areas to keep, and I'm going to basically just click inside of the Lego character's head. I'm going to zoom in a wee bit just to see if there's stuff that I've missed off. Click inside of his hand, and any other items that I'd like to try and keep will be selected. Okay, so there's the shadow being chopped off, and now by clicking on Keep Changes, what's happened is it's done a really good job of creating that transparent background for me. Okay, so you can see it's done a much nicer job than just using that Publisher type tool. Now that I've done that, I'm going to select my picture, I'm going to cut him, and I'll bring him back over here into my document. I may elect to look at doing a crop because I've got all this extra space here that I want to get rid of. So a crop allows you to get rid of all of the unwanted material from your image. Okay, so here it is. Here's now down to a much smaller size. Here's an example now that if I was to use the wrap points for this, again it's going to be picking out the fact that it is transparent, so same as the ones that we had before. Okay, so there's our images now starting to use up the page. Other things that we might decide to do to make this stand out is one, look at changing the font once again. Okay, so the font that we used on the first page was this Candera font for me, so I'm going to select this, and because it's quite a small font and I've got quite a lot of room still remaining on my page, I'm going to increase something called the line spacing. So we've looked at the paragraph spacing. I can do it before each paragraph if I'd like, but I'm going to increase the line spacing just a little bit to try and help lighten the page. Okay, so by doing it to 1.25, it's going to help fill up the page a little bit nicer. Okay, so just be careful not to overuse that particular concept because too big a gap will make things look a little bit silly. So it's a bit of trial and error for this particular option here. And of course you can come in here and just alter these slightly. So if you want to alter the gap slightly, you can use that. Once you get happy with that particular option, again, Format Painter tool, applying it afterwards to all of our existing text. Okay, it just means that we're going to get that consistency coming through. Okay, so I've missed a bit of text here. This is where you've got to be a little bit careful because we have gone into 2 text boxes now and need to make sure that I don't miss anything out. I haven't done it for the paragraphs here, the bullet points, because otherwise I'll lose my bullet points, so I'm going to go through and select that manually. One of the issues that we have with bullet points is that it does actually normally apply some quite large line spacing after the paragraphs, and instead of paragraph spacing after, I might decide to apply the line spacing. You can kind of have a bit of a play with what you'd like to do with some of those options, but I'm going to try and reduce it down so that rather than in between each line, it's between each bullet point. So therefore I selected the 3-point spacing between bullets was the choice that I did before. Okay, so there's your 3-point. Sometimes what we have is when we have bullet points is the fact that we've got a large gap happening between the bullet point and the text. This little arrow symbol indicates the fact that we've pushed the tab key. If I'd like to try and reduce the gap down, I can grab these little indent markers and drag them left and right to try and bring the bullet point a bit closer in. Okay, and that just helps with, again, that concept called proximity. Alright, so that's some of our text now coming through, and I might decide, look, I've still got a bit of space here to try and work with, so doing things like increasing image sizes. By doing that now, I may decide to look at changing the order of some of this text as well. So for instance, this builds your fitness. Maybe this is a shorter article and I'd like to bring it over here. Okay, being careful with chopping things off. Okay, I notice that I've lost the start of the sentence. Okay, so find your weapon, bringing it back in. Other things to be careful of is the fact that we've got this text that is now wrapping a bit funny around this image. So just being careful to make sure that we are consistent and we are reviewing our work constantly. Okay, so we've now started to fill up our pages quite nicely. Other things that I've got a couple of images which I've missed off, so I might decide to look at doing some of those similar type things that I've done before. And I've got another image that I can use now on the back page. You'll notice there is too much text now for these opening pages, but in terms of being able to fill our document, we've got this whole back page that rather than leaving empty, why don't we try and make these pictures really stand out and utilize this back page instead of trying to jam it all in. So in order to do that, maybe I want to try and make this text box a wee bit smaller and bring the text over the side here. And utilize things a bit differently. So this is where the trial and error side comes in, and really spending the time to go through and design the document to the best of your abilities. It does take experience and time, and often getting other people's ideas and feedback on this can be quite useful. So we've got text and overflow, fill it into that back page. Again, same story, we want it in the same positioning top left as everywhere else, just so we get that kind of repetition coming through, and then maybe bringing the likes of that fitness item onto this back page, bring it to the front. Still got lots of room, so I could look at playing with some of the image sizes. Checking out the thickness of the lines would be a good way of working out whether the images are of a similar kind of weight and proportion. Okay, and you can see here we've now got text coming through. So using that same kind of idea, paragraph spacing, okay, this is the spacing that we want, and you'll notice it's different, so Format Painter is a fast way of doing those kinds of things. In terms of the way that we're taught to read, we are taught to read from top to bottom and left to right. So whenever we've got really important information, this is the way people are taught to read. They're taught to read in this kind of format. Okay, so the most important information should be at this top left hand corner, and the least important information normally in this bottom left hand corner and the top right. Because people's eyes are naturally drawn to things like images, these least important parts of the page well filled with the likes of images, because then people are naturally drawn to those images as well. So that can be a useful way to try and fill things up. Okay, so other things that we want to try and avoid is the likes of hyphenation. So when we have a new text box being placed on here, or information that shouldn't be hyphenated, such as people's names or place names, that's an area that we've got to be very careful of. So if I was to draw a text box in here and maybe fill this with something that shouldn't be hyphenated, like a place name, let's see what happens when we make our text box too small. This would be an example of a proper noun that is not supposed to be hyphenated. It's the little dash that you can see there. We need to avoid that. We can avoid that by, one, trying to resize our text box so things aren't cut off, but that's kind of unreliable, because if we're moving text around the whole time and things are bumping around, we're going to probably leave some stuff behind. A better way to do this is to actually turn off the hyphenation for that text box. So highlight all the information that's in that text box, so you can Control A, and then you can come up the top here and then turn off hyphenation by unchecking this box, which would normally be selected. So here's a new text box. Going to untick the hyphenation option, and it basically means now that it will not hyphenate, it will simply show you as being text in overflow. Probably the safest way to do this altogether is to go to the File menu, go down to Options, and then go to the Advanced option and turn off or uncheck this box here for automatically hyphenating new text boxes. That means if you're always on the same computer, every new text box that you make from this point on will have that disabled. So it means that we don't run the risk of hyphenating proper nouns. Okay, so that's how you can turn off the likes of hyphenation. If we wanted to try and think about how we might make this page look a little bit different and try and experiment a wee bit more, some of the things that we could look at doing is to use columns. So to do columns, under the Format Text Box item, you can select columns, and you can pick out the number of columns that you'd like to try and work with. So sometimes if you have to have text fully justified, this can be a little bit of a problem, because the text often is very, very close together and you can't see the separation between those two columns. So to try and get around that, you can go to the columns option, go down to more columns, and then you can tweak some of the spacing between the two. Another good way of trying to organize this is by using a concept called line to try and visually separate them through using a straight line. Okay, so by using a straight line, by pushing the Shift key, it will lock it into being a straight line. I could try and pick out the colors that I've used through the rest of my document. I could increase the thickness or the weight of this particular line to make it be a little bit thicker, and by doing that, that's another good way of trying to make things separate out a wee bit. And sometimes pulling items out of those text boxes to try and have things aligned at the top would make this a bit more visually pleasing. So you can see with these bullet points here coming up the top here, wouldn't look as, I think it would look better if this was actually pushed down a wee bit. And again, rather than just pushing enter, which is not a great technique, using a separate text box for this heading and then splitting that out from this would be probably an easier way of getting that same effect to occur. Using the fully justified text, we have to be a little bit careful, because sometimes we get big gaps like this occurring, and that's not that pleasing on the eye, especially if you've got several of those over several lines occurring, and we sometimes see big rivers of gaps occurring, and that's one of the things that we need to be careful of as designers. So that's using a concept of line. Another thing we sometimes want to do, using that same concept of line, if we were to go back to a singular text box with a single column, is to use the use of line. And rather than underlining things, as I mentioned before, which I don't think looks very good, we could decide to make the use of that underlining really stand out by applying things like an exaggerated line and increasing perhaps the weight of it to make that really a bit of a feature. And if we like the idea of that, then what we could do is we could copy and paste it across to some of our other headings that we could have to try and get that consistency throughout. Because it just makes that a bit more of a kind of a design feature coming through, rather than like it's a bit of a mistake. One of the items, if you are looking to use, to be careful of is the fact that when things bump around, we want to have things positioned quite closely to where they all are for everything else. So it wouldn't look good if we have this further down the page with a larger gap. So try and get that repetition throughout. Okay, so you can see a bit more work needed to try and organise this document. Another thing that we have to be sometimes careful of is when we have lines of text like this all by itself. When we have a line of text all by itself like that, we can sometimes have a bit of a problem. It doesn't look as nice, and maybe by rebumping these things down a wee bit, or by altering some of the wrapping on this item, we can try and avoid the likes of that singular line wrapping all by itself. Maybe by making things a wee bit bigger, we can avoid having that particular effect occur. Okay, so again, just having a bit of a play with some of the tools, or if you are struggling like I am at this stage, maybe by changing some of the wrapping so that there is more than one line of text would be a way around that. Another thing that we sometimes have to be careful of is when we have a singular line of text, all by itself like this. So here is a heading, and this heading relates to this text here. So not just for headings, but for other lines of text as well. If it's all by itself, it's often referred to as something called a widow or an orphan. So a widow is what's happening here. We've got a line of text and it's all by its lonesome, and the alternative to that is where we have an orphan, and the orphan is where we've got maybe several lines all by itself, or one line all by itself over the side here. So again, we want to try and avoid this, so playing with some of the options to bring more or less text over is something that we need to be looking to use. The next concept which we've used within class that can be quite useful is something called a drop cap. So a drop cap draws the reader's attention to the star of an article. So using the format option, you can go through and apply something called a drop cap, and there's all these preset ones in there which I think look a little bit terrible. I'd probably always encourage you to use this custom drop cap, so you can kind of pick out some of the fonts that you've already been using, and you can customize how big a drop cap it's going to be. Because we don't want it to dominate and be larger than our heading, I would suggest that we need to be looking to alter this down so that it is a bit smaller, and then you can play with some of these different options for how you would like it to occur. So I might select this option, and then you can say how many lines that I'd like to span over. I'd like to pick out maybe the sentence, the heading font. So for me, I use Chiller. So if I was to type in Chiller and bring this up, that would kind of tie in with everything else. And I may decide to also look at tying them with the colour from what I had before. So if I apply that, having to be a little bit careful because I think that's a bit large compared to my heading, so I'd probably want to tweak that a little bit. Okay, so having a bit of a play with some of those options is probably a good thing to do, or I could choose to make my headings here a bit larger, because again I've got quite a lot of room still to play with. Because I've applied that there, I'd want to use my Format Painter tool, reapply that same kind of style to all of my other headings to get good consistency. And don't forget the back page as well, where probably you've got some of that text now overflowing. Alright, so we're getting to a stage where we've started to frame this document up quite nicely, and you can see with a bit more time on this I'd probably make it look a lot more consistent and nicer, but you'll get the general idea of what I'm trying to achieve here. Alright, so I've actually just had a bit of a refine of my document here, and I'm starting to think I'm struggling with this find a weapon because it's actually going onto 2 pages. So because the sequence of this article doesn't really matter, because I can rearrange some of these items, what I'm going to try and do is to take some of this text and try and change the positioning of things. So because these are linked text boxes, if I was to come down here and place this new heading across the side, everything else is going to bump down for me, and I'm going to resize this box, and all of that now has flowed over into this back page, which I think is going to work a bit better for me in terms of the types of content that I've got. Okay, so bring this forward, apply this wrapping on it, bring it forward, and then I'm able to bring in this picture again, and I think by doing that it's probably going to allow me to fill this page a bit nicer. Obviously that heading we want to try and place onto that back page, so you could reduce the size of this text box a little bit, and I think this is probably going to fit a bit nicer. I'll copy that on there, and then move this like so, and get into a stage now I think that's pretty happy. I'm going to experiment with maybe rotating some of those items around, and I can use the flip horizontal tool to see if that's maybe a better positioning for the likes of my my weapons. Okay, so I think there's my document getting pretty close to being finished now, and so I'm now wanting to go through and just introduce a couple of other concepts that some of you may be using. So in terms of us wanting to go through and to improve the looks of a document, one of the things we've got to be careful of is the use of word art. I would normally say don't use word art because there are some very commonly used problems that people come across. One of the biggest problems that people have through word art is the fact that it's a very commonly used thing and people kind of see these all the time, and they generally will struggle to get good consistency or repetition with them. So with this particular style here, if you were to try and resize things and reshape things and color things in, and if I was to go and try and edit the text, you'll notice that it's saying 60 point. However, if I was to go through and copy that and place some more text in there that's maybe a little bit different, and try and apply that same 60 point, it's still saying it's 60 point, and yet the font and the sizing of that is very different, and as a result it's hard to get good repetition and use this consistently across our document. So there's just probably very few reasons why I would select word art. One of the reasons why I would choose to do word art is if you're wanting to do things like a gradient or filling the letters with things like a picture. So by going into here you can decide to fill the word art with the likes of a picture, and then that would be a way of actually applying some kind of interesting effect through the background there, or things like maybe a gradient through the back. So by doing that is probably an example of why I may choose to use a word art over something else. Okay, but generally not a great technique, and with some of those other fonts that we've got, you've probably got some better options in terms of what we can do with them. Another thing I'd like to just quickly show is the use of grouping. So if we've done quite a lot of work on particular shapes that we've maybe composited or joined together, we may have several items such as this line and this box that we somehow want to group together. By holding the shift key and clicking, we've now selected the rectangle and this line, and if I'm wanting to use this again and again, one of the things that we sometimes do is to group them together. When they are grouped together, they're now treated as a singular shape and much easier to try and copy and paste these as a single item rather than multiple. If you're wanting to undo that, just ungroup, and there you go, we're back to a singular item once more. Sometimes rather than using plain square boxes to try and make things stand out, such as what we've done here, or a rectangular box, some of the styles that you can do that I think look quite effective is the use of some of our rounded boxes. Okay, sometimes that rounded effect can look quite nice. So I could decide to apply this kind of formatting and apply it in here, and you'll notice there's that kind of colour and style popping on through. And then if it was to have some kind of border perhaps on a box, that might make it look a little bit softer around the edges. Another thing that people sometimes want to do is to apply like a page border, and again doing this with the likes of some of these rounded text boxes can help be maybe a different effect. Okay, so I'm going to fill that with nothing and maybe increase the size or thickness of that line, okay, just to make it maybe a bit more visible. Maybe we're doing things like we're changing the colours of it slightly as well. Okay, so there's a bit of an idea of using some of the rounded boxes. I quite like having mine being quite subtle, so I'm going to take this yellow marker and just look at applying it like so. Okay, there you go, so there's my box now, and I may need to look at just reducing the size down of this text box. If I'm happy with that and I want to be consistent, I could look at bringing that into those middle pages, and because that could work quite well, I may decide, hey look, I don't want people to mess with that for while I'm doing my designing. So there is a concept that we can use called something called a master page. If we'd like something to be placed onto every single page consistently, if we go and place it onto our master page like here, and then paste it again and bring it over the left hand side, it means that now that we've done that, that will be on every single page from this point on. Okay, so we've now got a couple of text boxes, or boxes I should say. By positioning them there, will be on every single page. To make that quite obvious, what I'll do is I'll place a smiley face as well onto this page and come out of the master page now, so you can see that we've got the smiley face and all these boxes, but the smiley face I can't click on it, and if I was to insert some more pages, what you'll notice is that on every right hand side page we've got the smiley face being pushed there or placed there. If we've made a mistake and realised that, hey no, we wanted to have a different kind of colour on that, or positioning it slightly different, we go and make that change in here, hit that with a different colour, close the master page, and that will be applied to every other single document that we might have. Next thing that we might decide to do, I'm just going to remove some of those pages. We've made a bit of a mistake. I'm going to right click, delete on those, and in this case I can choose to delete both pages. It has actually inserted an extra page here because of the way that a booklet would need to work, so I'm going to delete both pages for this one here, and I'm going to delete this last page here, and in this situation I'm going to delete the right hand page only. Okay, so we're now back to our singular format, and there's our kind of rounded booklet. So again, I may need to look at deciding to alter slightly the width of some of these text boxes so that we've got a bit more of a gap happening, because we don't want things kind of being on top of each other. Okay, so that could be the case for all of these items. You can see here it's very, very close in terms of my text, so I may choose to just bring this over slightly and alter some of these other items in through here. Okay, so now we're getting to a stage where we're wanting to look at printing and seeing what this might look like in its final finished form. Okay, so we're going to use a couple of tools to try and help you do that. I might just go and turn off my little smiley face for this. Alright, and now that that's been done, we wanted to proof this and see what this might look like as a finished form. So good tools to try and check to see if our document's okay is to come under the Info tab and run this thing called a design checker. This is going to check my document to see if there are any problems that I might be having. So not all of these will be a problem, but things like a story with text and overflow is probably showing me that there is some stuff that I've missed off. It is indicating that there is some text that is not being shown through this text box, and if I was to zoom in here, If I make this a little bit bigger, yes, there's some text and overflow. So that would be a big problem for me because there's some text that isn't being used or being seen. So I need to make sure that I don't lose any of that information. So it's gotten rid of some of those items. Some of these ones here, object encroaches non-printable region for the master page, those aren't things that we need to have a problem with. One of the things that we sometimes have an issue with is when we have some text that is maybe going into the margins. Even after a print preview we think, look, that's still okay. This info checker is going to identify those as a potential issue. Just because it's showing here as a problem doesn't mean it necessarily is. Things that you need to be a little bit careful of, however, is when you take a picture like so and you stretch it. When we start doing that, we're taking the image out of its correct proportion and it will indicate a problem like so. There are some images such as our background where that's not going to be a problem, but as soon as we start messing with the height and the width of these images that are out of proportion, we are going to be needing to make sure that it still looks good. This one is saying it's a problem. If I go to look at some of the choices available to me, I can actually fix this issue and it will stick things in the correct proportion using that size that I've indicated. By using the corner handles, it's now brought the correct proportion. Sometimes you can't actually undo or fix that issue, so probably the best situation to do under here is to go to Format and to reset the picture back to its original shape and size. Other issues that we sometimes have through this is when we take a picture and we make it too large for the size that we'd like it to go. So for instance, this particular picture that I've got, if I was to make it really, really large, this is trying to exaggerate the problem that we're going to have. It will say that it is a low resolution picture. If you get a picture off the web, this is one of the common problems that we have. If we go to print this off in this particular size, you will see the pixels, you'll see it not looking that great, it might be blurry, and this error is trying to indicate that, hey, this picture needs to be much smaller in order for the quality to be good. So just bear that in mind when you're getting pictures. Make sure they're of a good quality that can handle being as large as you need them to be. We don't need to be this large because of the size of our booklet or publication type. So now that we've run this particular design checker and we're happy with some of the errors that have popped up, we're now wanting to print preview our work and to look at doing our final prints. So under the File Print option, you've got access to colour printers. However, I've only got a black and white, which I've now disabled, so you won't. So you'll still be able to see this in colour. Print previewing it can be a useful item. I'm going to select that I'd like to do it in grayscale to begin with, and this is simply so I can see what the document looks like without colour, so that I'm not getting distracted by all the pretty colours that I might have. If it looks good in black and white, generally it's going to probably look good in colour as well. And I can think about things such as the images, the text, and is things clear. So things that I'm paying particular note of is, are any of these boxes that are going close to the margins being cut off? Because sometimes on our pages, if they go a little bit too far or a little bit too high, when we go to print preview, that information is cut off. So I'm pretty happy with this one, and if I go onto the front page, let's see what this front page looks like. I've got a bit of duplication happening with the border here, so that's something that I'd probably want to be disabling, as well as some of these other items. Here's a good example of that concept I mentioned earlier called an orphan. This would be a good example of something that needs to be fixed up before I print, as well as this line coming through. So once you're happy with how things are looking, then we're wanting to print things off. So in order to print, we should be pretty much leaving most of these settings alone. We're going to be printing to a color printer that's available on your network, and we're going to be printing all of the pages. It is going to be set up as a booklet side fold, which is what we want, and we just leave the paper size alone. Even though it says A4, it's because it's in a side fold booklet form that it's going to come out okay. The one option that we generally do need to change is this one here. Because it's going to be duplex printed or printed on both sides, what we're going to try and do is to tell it to flip it on the short edge, which is this left hand side here. If we tell it to flip it on the long edge, the middle page will actually be upside down when we open the booklet. So select the short edge, and then when you're happy with that particular option and nothing's changed through here, you can click on printing. And that, my friends, is pretty much all of the skills and concepts that you're going to need in order to try and go through and to create some of these attractive booklets and publications using the skills within a desktop publishing program. So I hope you've enjoyed some of these summaries, and no doubt there'll be some more of these to try and help you along your ways. Okay, good luck team.